Chapter 23, Fiscal Policy, or Summing Up. The purpose of this chapter is to review what we have learned about fiscal policy so far, to explore in more depth the dynamics of deficits and debt, and to shed light on the problems associated with high public debt. In most advanced economies, the financial crisis has led to large budget deficits and a large increase in debt to GDP ratios. Governments face a difficult choice: reduce deficits rapidly and reassure markets that they will pay their debt at the risk of lower growth or even a recession, or reduce deficits more slowly in order to avoid further slowing the recovery at the risk of not convincing investors that debt will be stabilized. Learning objectives. Understand the government budget constraint. Understand the relation between the change in debt, the initial level of debt, and the government spending and taxes. Know the implications of tax cuts on the path of debt and future taxes. Explain the determinants of changes in the debt to GDP ratio. Learning objectives. Understand the Ricardian equivalence proposition. Discuss the other three fiscal policy issues: stabilization, wars, and the dangers of high debt. Discuss the current state of the U.S. budget deficit. To understand the implications of a tax cut on the budget deficit and debt over time, and to see whether taxes will need to be raised in the future, we start by looking at the definition of the budget deficit. Equation 23.1 says the budget deficit equals spending, including interest payments on the debt, minus taxes net of transfers. Note, we measure interest payments as real interest payments, that is, the product of the real interest rate R times existing debt. This gives us the inflation-adjusted deficit. The official measures of the deficit use nominal interest payments and are therefore incorrect. G represents government spending on goods and services and does not include transfer payments. Transfers are instead subtracted from T, so that T stands for taxes minus transfers. Figure 1 plots the official measure and the inflation-adjusted measure of the federal budget deficits for the United States since 1969. The official measure shows a deficit in every year from 1970 to 1997. The inflation-adjusted measure shows instead alternating deficits and surpluses until the late 1970s. Today, with inflation running at about 1 to 2% of GDP a year and the ratio of debt to GDP equal to roughly 90%, the difference between the two measures is roughly equal to 1 to 2% times 90%, or 0.9 to 1.9% of GDP. The government budget constraint given by equation 23.2 simply states that the change in government debt during given year T is equal to the deficit during year T. If the government runs a deficit, government debt increases. If the government runs a surplus, government debt decreases. The government budget constraint links the change in government debt to the initial level of debt, which affects interest payments, and to current government spending and taxes. Equation 23.3 says debt at the end of year T equals interest payments on debt at the end of year T minus 1, given by the first term on the right side of the equation, plus the primary deficit during year T, given by the second term on the right side. Implications of the budget constraint as shown by figure 23-1. A. If taxes are cut by $1 in year 1 and repaid the next year, taxes have to be higher by 1 plus R in the second year. B. If taxes are cut by $1 in year 1, debt increases in each year till it is repaid in year 5. Taxes have to go up by 1 plus R to the power of 4. C. If taxes are cut by $1 in year 1 and the debt is stabilized after that from year 2 at $1, but it is not repaid, then taxes will have to be higher by R in each year from year 2 on. Conclusions. 1. If government spending is unchanged, a decrease in taxes must eventually be offset by an increase in taxes in the future. 2. The longer the government waits to increase taxes, or the higher the real interest rate is, the higher the eventual increase in taxes must be. 3. The legacy of past deficits is higher debt. 4. To stabilize the debt, the government must eliminate the deficit. 5. To eliminate the deficit, the government must run a primary surplus equal to the interest payments on the existing debt. This requires higher taxes forever. Equation 23.4 shows what happens if government waits till year T to repay the debt. Even if the primary deficit is zero in each year, starting with the second year, the debt continues to grow over time at a rate equal to the interest rate, even though taxes are cut only in year 1. Evolution of debt to GDP ratio, or simply debt ratio. Equation 23.5 says the change in debt ratio over time, the left side of the equation, is equal to the sum of two terms. The first term is the difference between the real interest rate and the growth rate times the initial debt ratio. The second term is the ratio of primary deficit to GDP. Equation 23.5 implies that the increase in the ratio of debt to GDP will be larger the higher the real interest rate, the lower the growth rate of output, the higher the initial debt ratio, the higher the ratio of primary deficit to GDP. Table 1 looks at 4 countries which reduced their debt to GDP ratios after World War II. For example, United Kingdom reduced its debt ratio from 270% in 1946 to 47% in 1975. It was a result of a combination of the factors enumerated by equation 23.5. The growth rate for all the countries was high. The real interest rate was not only low, it was negative because of high inflation rates, and all the countries had primary surpluses. Put another way, a large part of the decrease in debt ratios was achieved by paying bondholders negative real return on their bonds for many years. Primary surpluses accounted for only a small part of the decrease in the debt ratios. Ricardian equivalence, cyclically adjusted deficits, and war finance. In the light of the budget constraint, how should we look at the effects of deficit on output? According to the Ricardian proposition, if government finances spending through deficits, private saving will increase 1-to-1 in anticipation of higher taxes in the future, with the decrease in public saving, leaving total saving unchanged. The total amount of investment will not be affected, and thus future output will not be affected. High debt is no cause for concern. In reality, if tax increases appear to be in the distant future and their timing uncertain, consumers are likely to ignore them and increase spending today. In that case, Ricardian equivalence is likely to fail. In the short run, larger deficits are likely to lead to higher demand and to higher output. In the long run, higher government debt lowers capital accumulation and as a result lowers output. The concept of cyclically adjusted deficit is that if it is positive, it provides a useful warning that return of output to the natural level will not be enough to stabilize the debt. Deficits during wars are good for two reasons: lead to lower investment and hence lower output in the future, thus passing on the burden of war to those alive after the war. And secondly, taxes can be spread out over time instead of being very high during times of war. Figure 1 shows the federal government deficit projections for fiscal years 2010 to 2021. Looking at these projections in the medium run, the fiscal situation looks bad. Table 1 shows ratio of entitlement spending to GDP, the sum of Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid. is projected to increase by 7.3% of GDP from 2011 to 2050 because of our aging population and the increasing cost of healthcare. It is clear that major changes in entitlement programs will have to take place. Figure 23-2 shows the dangers of high debt. The interest rates on government bonds in Italy, Spain, and Belgium were much higher than in Germany. Investors wanted higher rates in order to lend money to governments of Italy, Spain, and Belgium because they had high deficits and debt compared to Germany, and investors considered them more risky. So, the danger of high debt is increase in the cost of borrowing for the government. High debt ratios increase the risk of vicious cycles. Higher perceived risk of default leads to higher interest rates and an increase in debt. Increase in debt, in turn, can lead to higher perceived risk of default and a higher interest rate. Governments may have no choice than to default or to rely on monetization of the debt through seigniorage, which can lead to hyperinflation. In either case, the economic costs are likely to be high. Equation 23.6 helps us to understand the dangers of high debt, how it can lead to hyperinflation, a term used to describe inflation in excess of 30% per month. Equation 23.6 says that the amount of real seigniorage, revenue generated by money creation, the government can generate is a product of two terms, the rate at which money supply increases and the real money stock. Both sides of the equation are in terms of share of monthly GDP. As government prints more money, it leads to inflation, which causes people to decrease the amount of money they wish to hold since money starts to lose value. Thus, to generate the same amount of seigniorage, the money supply will have to increase faster and faster, leading to higher and higher inflation. Table 23-1 summarizes the 7 major hyperinflations that followed World War I and World War II in different countries, all caused by deficit financing of wars through money finance. Money finance means the government is financing itself by money creation. This is a case of fiscal dominance. The government issues new bonds and tells the central bank to buy them. The central bank pays the government with the money it creates, and the government uses that money to finance its deficit. This process is called debt monetization.